I saw a story in Reuters about the NSA's bulk data collection program.
534 million. That's the number of phone calls and text messages collected by the U.S. National Security Agency last year.
530 million records of American phone calls and emails were collected by the NSA in 2017. That number is up from 2016's 151 million records. In this video, I'll consider the subject of the NSA data collection program. I'll start by offering my own arguments against the program, and then I'll look at some arguments in favor of the NSA surveillance and bulk data collection, which are offered by the House Intelligence Committee. I'll talk about some problems I have with those arguments, and why I ultimately don't find them compelling. The NSA's bulk surveillance of Americans should be massively curtailed. I'd like to see the numbers of records collected fall from hundreds of millions to tens of thousands, if not less. I have three arguments to support this position. First, power corrupts. Second, this technique is not useful for its nominal purpose. Third, the NSA cannot be trusted with this power and information due to their routine incompetence. Power corrupts. This argument is straightforward. Power allows people to do bad things. The more power people have over us, the more bad things they can inflict upon us. The government will want to start using its power against things other than terrorists. Drug dealers are an obvious choice, for example. Perhaps corporate lobbyists will persuade lawmakers to use surveillance to combat online piracy. The government, once given power, will not relinquish it without a fight. So we should not give the government the power to invade our privacy, document it, and use our private information against us. Some people will say that if they have done nothing wrong, then they have nothing to fear. This is false for two reasons. First, most people actually have done something illegal. There are a vast number of laws, and knowledge of complicated legal theories and precedents are required to interpret each of those laws. Very likely you've broken some kind of law recently, and you've committed some kind of felony, again, recently. It's not a problem for you right now because the government doesn't really care about the law you've broken. But suppose they are collecting all of your private records and storing them indefinitely. In 5 or 10 years, when that felony you didn't realize you'd committed becomes a more pressing issue, the government might simply run a records check and decide your time is due. Second, even if you have done nothing wrong, which is doubtful, you still have something to fear. The government could use the information that they've gathered to compel you to act. Imagine something along the lines of, "Hey, we want you to be an informant for us against your neighbor who's a dangerous drug dealer and part of a murderous cartel." And you say, "Well, actually, I've got a family. I don't really agree with the drug war anyway. I'm not super interested in risking my life to help you guys out, so just handle it yourselves." And they say, "Yeah, about that. Remember your nephew? It turns out he bought some drugs a year ago. Sure would hate to have him go to prison for the next decade," and so on. When we give the government massive information about everyone, we'll allow them to selectively prosecute anyone, and they can and will abuse this power to coerce us to do what they want. This isn't just a dystopian fantasy. Ruby Ridge is a famous case where the federal government tried a similar tactic to coerce a citizen into informing on the Aryan Nation gang. The ATF charged one Randy Weaver for having shotguns with barrels that were too short, and then they let him know that they would drop the charges if he would just become an informant against his neighbor who was in the Aryan Nation. When Weaver refused, it started a standoff which ended in federal agents killing Weaver's wife and son before arresting Weaver. Weaver was then acquitted of all the relevant charges and released, but his family was dead. The story of Ruby Ridge is a subject for a different video, but I strongly encourage you to look into it if you have any faith in letting the government do the right thing. The reason I bring up this story is to point out how the government can operate in the worst case. They can take information about nominal crimes, like having your shotgun barrels too short, and use it against you to disastrous effect. Randy Weaver's family was killed by the federal government. If we allow the federal government to gather up enormous amounts of information about all of us, not even making it clear what information they're gathering, and store that information indefinitely and use it against us at will, we are potentially setting up many more situations where the federal government could abuse their power against us. They have done it in the past. They will do it in the future. There are other ways that the government could abuse their power beyond just using it to compel you to do dangerous things. Another example would be if the intelligence agencies wanted a bill passed to increase their authority, or perhaps they want more funding. The NSA, with hundreds of millions of records to call upon, billions of records to call upon, could find wrongdoing on the part of relevant political figures and use it to compel those figures to act the way that the NSA or the intelligence community wants. Imagine telling a senator, if you're an NSA representative, that you would reveal his affair to his wife, or some racist email he wrote, or the fact that he had used illegal drugs if he didn't vote the way you wanted on a particular bill. Purely as an illustration, and I want to emphasize that I am in no way suggesting this happened, but purely as an illustration, consider Congressman Anthony Weiner. His voting record on Homeland Security shows he voted against extending the Patriot Act, voted for requiring warrants for electronic surveillance, voted for civil oversight on intelligence gathering. Then he accidentally tweeted a lewd photo of himself on his public Twitter account. So ask yourself, how do you know that this wasn't the work of corrupt intelligence agencies removing a problematic congressman and making an example of him? They could have used their bulk data collection tool and looked up the problematic congressman, discovered that he was sending illicit pictures to a number of young women, and then used similar means to gain access to his Twitter account and tweet the illicit pictures in public, getting him removed from office. Again, I'm not saying that this happened. I have no evidence, and I don't really believe it happened that way, but I'm using it as an illustration or an example of how a corrupt intelligence agency might abuse their power to remove a problematic politician if they were so inclined. And removing a politician this way might also have a chilling effect on other political figures, other congressmen, who might realize that people who were opposed to the intelligence agencies tended to get revealing information, tended to have their political career ruined by private information about them being publicly revealed. We should not give intelligence agencies the power to perform bulk collection of American records because it will give them too much power and allow them to corrupt and control our republic.
Tell me definitively, is that a photograph of you?
We're trying to find out where that photograph came from.
5 days after the alleged hack, Weiner hasn't even reported it to law enforcement.
Do we really want to have the taxpayers pay for a big investigation of that? I think not.
Bulk data collection is not useful for the nominal purpose, fighting terrorism. The collection of data in bulk will only be effective against careless adversaries and the general population. Sophisticated adversaries will use sophisticated means to elude our surveillance, and unsophisticated adversaries will use unsophisticated means. Steganography is the technique of sending messages such that observers cannot tell that any message has been sent. Imagine we wanted to set something like this up. So we share a Twitter hashtag that sees 100 or so tweets a day. I'm the recipient, so I have a computer program that constantly looks for pictures associated with our hashtag and downloads those pictures. You're the sender, so you take a message, encrypt it, and then encode it into an image. It'll appear as a few random bytes in a specific location in the image. You can then tweet with the public hashtag. My program will download your picture like it downloads everyone's picture with that hashtag, and then discover your encrypted message when it checks the specific file location, and make that message available to me. There's no way for an observer like the NSA doing bulk data collection to notice this kind of exchange is happening between two specific people. I don't even need to know the Twitter account you're using, or you could use a different Twitter account with every message you send me. This is a crude example of steganography, but more sophisticated measures are possible. The point is, a sophisticated adversary would use a sophisticated means to evade whatever bulk data collection the NSA might be doing. Unsophisticated adversaries may not be familiar with the finer points of steganography. but they may simply realize that electronic communications are inherently risky against a technologically superior opponent, and therefore our unsophisticated adversaries may simply avoid electronic communications. So what use is an NSA bulk data gathering program collecting phone calls and emails if messages are being exchanged in person in a market in Pakistan? Bulk data collection could catch terrorists who are dumb, crazy, or lazy. There is not great evidence that this is an effective tool for catching such terrorists. I'll go into more on that later, but in principle it could work against those kind of terrorists. The other people who bulk data collection works reliably against are average citizens who aren't taking any measures to protect their communications. This, I believe, is the true target of the NSA surveillance, explaining why they have to gather hundreds of millions of records about Americans every year, billions in the past, when there are far, far fewer terrorists. The NSA are not trustworthy, by which I don't mean that they are potentially evil or that we can't trust them to do good. I already covered that earlier. Instead, I mean we just can't trust them to do a good job at what they're tasked with. The charter for the NSA is to monitor, collect, and process information for foreign intelligence and counterintelligence purposes. The NSA is also responsible for the protection of American communications and information. For the first part of their charter, it's tough to evaluate how well they're doing as their efforts are secret. Shortly, I'll go into detail about why some of their success stories are highly unconvincing. For the second part of their charter, they don't seem to be doing that very well at all. Let's think about a few recent NSA failures. Edward Snowden was a contractor at the NSA, and he was able to anonymously exfiltrate massive amounts of the NSA's most secret data and then abscond from the country. The NSA did not know Snowden's identity until after he leaked the information and identified himself publicly. If we can't trust the NSA to keep any of their own secrets from a contractor, why would we possibly trust them with the massive amounts of data that they are gathering about us? Remember, if criminals, villains, or foreign countries wanted that data for themselves, they are more than capable of bribing, threatening, or otherwise subverting a contractor at the NSA and stealing it all for themselves. The Office of Personnel Management hack was a gigantic cyber heist. Hackers infiltrated the Office of Personnel Management and stole millions of records from federal background checks. An article in Wired explains that the Office of Personnel Management had, quote, 18 million copies of Standard Form 86, a 127-page questionnaire for federal security clearance that includes probing questions about an applicant's personal finances, substance abuse, and psychiatric care. The agency also warehouses the data that is gathered on applicants for some of the government's most secretive jobs. That data can include everything from lie detector results to notes about whether an applicant engages in risky sexual behavior, end quote. And also, quote, the hackers delved into the complete personnel files of 4.2 million employees, past and present. Then, just weeks before the OPM booted them out, they grabbed approximately 5.6 million digital images of government employee fingerprints, end quote. The OPM hack is, of course, a failure for the Office of Personnel Management. However, it's also a failure in my mind for the agency responsible for our country's signal intelligence and counterintelligence efforts. The OPM hack was likely perpetrated by a state actor, probably China. The NSA was nowhere to be found in this story. Shouldn't the NSA be detecting and thwarting intelligence efforts like this one? Shouldn't they be testing the cyber defenses of American agencies? The NSA also didn't realize that the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was conducting classified state business on a private and insecure email server. If they're responsible for keeping American information safe, shouldn't they be looking at any of this? There's no evidence that they are, though. We have no evidence that the NSA will be reliable stewards of the information that they are gathering. On the contrary, the NSA is demonstrably incapable of keeping their own information safe or protecting our country from major cyber espionage. So why should we trust them with more personal private data? Arguments in favor of bulk data collection. The Reuters story is about warrantless internet surveillance conducted under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Intelligence has a website to present facts on Section 702 and arguments in favor of it. In a document titled Reasons to Support FISA Section 702, the House Intelligence Committee gives two arguments. First, they say Section 702 was instrumental in the defeat of top ISIL terrorist Haji Iman. Haji Iman was a school teacher turned terrorist who rose through the ranks to become ISIL's treasurer until, thanks to 702 surveillance, he met his demise at the hands of a U.S. Special Forces raid. The argument is, if it weren't for Section 702, then Haji Iman would still be alive and plotting against America. This is quite a bad argument, as there is no reason to think that Haji Iman would have been immortal or undetectable without 702 surveillance. There is nothing here about how he would have been impossible to detect and eliminate via conventional means. Furthermore, the idea that we have to collect hundreds of millions of records of American phone calls and emails every year in order to surveil a high-level ISIL plotter who lived in Afghanistan and Iraq his whole life is absurd on its face. How about instead of surveilling millions, hundreds of millions of Americans, you just surveil the thousands of people in ISIS? A fun fact about Haji Iman is that this is the third time U.S. or allied forces have killed him. Previously, Haji Iman was killed in a U.S. airstrike on a mosque in Iraq in May 2015. Haji Iman was supposedly one of the dozens killed in the mosque strike. Only it turned out later that he wasn't killed at all. But I'm sure those dozens of other mosque attendees were all terrorists, though, so it's fine. Another airstrike reportedly killed Haji Iman in December 2015, but again he survived. You know what they say though, third time's the charm. Now he's definitely dead for sure. And we definitely couldn't have probably killed this guy without Section 702. Thanks, 702. The next argument that the House Intelligence Committee gives is equally poor. It's another example of a terrorist who was apprehended thanks to the surveillance enabled by Section 702. This time our terrorist is Najibullah Zazi. Zazi was a refugee from Afghanistan who lived in Denver, Colorado. Zazi started doing research about how to build a bomb. He exchanged emails with ISIS-connected people about bomb making, and then he started to acquire supplies to make bombs, and was apparently planning on conducting a bombing attack on New York City. The House Intelligence Committee claims that the NSA picked up Zazi's communication and referred him to the FBI. Interestingly, the FBI agent who requested a warrant for Zazi's arrest did not mention the NSA or Section 702. The FBI agent makes it seem like they picked up Zazi when they noticed him traveling to and from an especially dangerous part of Pakistan. They then sat a couple of agents outside of Zazi's house and noticed him doing some suspicious things. They arranged for him to meet with an informant who talked with him about his terror schemes, and then they arrested Zazi. Maybe 702 was essential here, but the FBI didn't mention it in their warrant application, and it's not mentioned in Zazi's indictment either. It's also not mentioned in the DOJ press release about Zazi pleading guilty. So maybe we couldn't have caught Zazi any other way than using Section 702 surveillance. But that's not really clear, and there's no real evidence for that premise. Those are the only reasons given in the House Intelligence Committee document offering support for Section 702. Hey, we caught these two terrorists. Isn't that enough to let us invade your privacy, gathering hundreds of millions of records about what you're saying online or who you're calling, storing them indefinitely, and potentially using them against you at any point in the future? I mean, we caught those two guys, right? Isn't that good enough? There's also a document titled Myth versus Fact about Section 702 on the same website, which is quite interesting. A number of allegations and facts in this document are seemingly meant to assuage fears that Section 702 will be used against Americans. The document says, truth, in uppercase. Section 702 is never used to target Americans. No evidence that Section 702 has ever been intentionally used to target Americans. Doing so would be illegal. Pay attention to the word intentionally there. Another one, Section 702 authority has not been used and may not be used to target Americans for surveillance. Doing so would be illegal and no such violations have occurred. Well, how do they know no such violations have occurred? But their real weasel word there is targeted. They don't target Americans, instead they just do bulk data collection and gather untargeted information accidentally about Americans. Here's another one. Section 702 is not used to target Americans. Again, the word is target. and the targets of Section 702 are always foreign persons located overseas. It's like nobody ever told the authors of this document that the other document includes the story of Najbola Zazi, a permanent American resident who was targeted by Section 702, and his emails were read and phone calls were listened to, and he ultimately wound up in a federal prison. So yes, it absolutely has happened that Section 702 has been used against American persons. The same people putting forward the argument that it hasn't been included an example of a time when it was. In fact, fully half of the examples that they can cite of 702 leading to terrorists involve Section 702 being used against American residents and not foreign people in foreign lands. The document goes on to explain that even though Section 702 cannot be used against Americans, they can and do incidentally gather information about Americans, totally unintentionally. Incidentally, we gathered 500 million records about American phone calls this year. And then, of course, they can refer this to the FBI, as they did with Zazi. Don't worry, though, the FBI cannot use 702 against you in a targeted way. They have to get a warrant, but they can totally surveil you and arrest you after that. So to reiterate, 702 cannot be used intentionally targeted against Americans. It can only be used to unintentionally gather information about Americans and then refer that to the FBI for further investigation and prosecution. They also have one other fun explanation here. They explain that they are allowed to query their database of records for information about U.S. citizens because, quote, querying lawfully collected Section 702 collection is not the initiation of new surveillance or a new search protected under the Fourth Amendment, end quote. So in other words, they can do this massive bulk collection of data of hundreds of millions of records from American phone calls and emails because they are not intentionally targeting American citizens. So that's fine. And then they can specifically target American citizens who just happen to be in their database, because querying a database of lawfully collected data is perfectly legal and it's not a new specific search and it's not protected by the Fourth Amendment. But remember, Section 702 totally can't be used against Americans, though. Let me sum up the arguments of the House Intelligence Committee in favor of Section 702. Over a decade, they've collected billions of records of communications of Americans. Sifting through these records over a decade or more, they have found two terrorists. One, Najbola Zazi, was a high school dropout who traveled to al-Qaeda-dominated regions of Pakistan, who then tried to build a bomb out of supplies he bought at a beauty parlor, and had in-depth conversations with an FBI informant. The other is a high-ranking ISIS leader who is probably dead. These arguments are entirely unconvincing. I simply do not believe that there is no other way to catch these people. Zazi should have been caught by conventional means, and Haji Iman should have been caught because he's a high-ranking officer of ISIS. We should have been able to know who he was through traditional surveillance as well. The arguments in favor of Section 702 are entirely unconvincing. Remember, those who would trade liberty for safety deserve neither. We don't need NSA spying campaigns against Americans. Shut it down and give us our privacy back. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by clicking the like button. If you want to see more content in a similar style, go ahead and subscribe. I am considering 4 topics for my next video. First is looking into whether or not Mike Pence hates gay people. Second, exploring the Iran deal. Third, considering effective ways to protest Facebook. Or fourth, documenting the process of how to build and release a website that I'd work on as a hobbyist project. If you've made it this far into the video, then your opinion would be highly meaningful to me. So leave a comment describing which of those options you'd like to see, or if you have any other ideas, I'd be interested in those as well. Thanks for your time.